Konrad now.
Well, thank you, Teresa, for this wonderful introduction and very long one too. You could have cut it shorter, I think. I'm so glad to be able to talk to all of you about the Giuliano Dalmati. I would ask that you turn off your videos. So that way, when I do the share screen and I show the slides, you will have a full screen. It's a great honor for me to be able to talk to the students at Guelph and to my friends and colleagues who have known about my current research on the Giuliano Dalmati. I got interested in the topic very late in life. In 1990, I had been living in Toronto for nearly 20 years and did not know about the community, of which I am a member, I should say, having been born there. And I found out about it. I started to attend their meetings, and now I am deeply involved with them, as you will see. My talk tonight starts off a little bit as a historical talk, and then I will switch over to talk about the community in Canada. And then I will eventually move over to talk about some of the literature and finish off with some ideas about what to do next. So let me do share screen. And everybody, if you could turn off your camera, that would be great. Sandra, I think yours is Sandra Bosic. Your camera is still on, so turn it off. Um, thank you. Here we go. So a different sort of Italian, the Julian Dalmatian immigrants in Canada. Uh, Italian Canadians are, what do we mean by Italian Canadians? They are Canadians who have full or partial Italian heritage, and also Italians who are not yet Canadian citizens, but have migrated to Canada and now reside in Canada. Census 2021, there was 1.5 million Canadians, 4.3% of the total population, who claimed full or partial Italian ancestry. That is a huge sum for a country such as Canada. Most of these Italians, first, second, and third generation Italians, came to Canada because of, somebody's got the microphone on, will you please turn it off? Came to Canada because of economic reasons. It's an economic migration that was driven by poverty at home. We think about the poverty of Italy after World War II and how many Italians came here in the 1950s, for example. Then, when Italy got going really well economically, that flow of immigrants reduced to just a trickle. What we're finding now is most of the Italians who are coming out to Canada are not coming because of poverty at home, but looking instead for upper end jobs like professorships or engineerships and so forth. That economic migration was there also after the First World War in the 1920s. It was also there in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, during the Italian movement for unification and after Italy was united. Remember that United Italy brought in the whole South, and there was a lot of poverty and not enough work. So a lot of Italians came to the United States and to Canada in the second half of the 19th century. But there has also been political migration to Canada and to the United States and to other countries outside of Italy. Italians have left for political reasons as a result of war or because they were exiles or because of the ideas that they held. I gave you three examples here. Giuseppe Mazzini, a great intellectual from northern Italy, who had to flee to England during the Italian unification movement. Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was an insurgent, we would say. He was a fighter and they had to flee twice as exile, and he went to South America, and he helped to liberate several South American countries, so that he's deemed to be a hero in Latin America. And in Canada, we actually have a mountain named after him. Also, James Forneri, who was a teacher, had liberal, democratic, Republican ideas, felt obligated to leave Italy in the mid 1800s, came to Canada, first to Nova Scotia, and then he was hired by the University of Toronto to set up the Modern Languages Department. And he is the first professor of Italian at the University of Toronto in the 1850s, if I remember correctly. So we have a long tradition at the University of Toronto of teaching Italian and of housing, hosting, welcoming emigres, political emigres from Italy. The more recent political emigres from Italy are actually the Italian exiles and refugees who came in the second half of the 20th century in the wake of World War II, most of them in the 1950s, but some of them already in the late 1940s. They are Italians, original Aboriginal Italians, native Italians from the lands that Italy had to cede to Yugoslavia as war reparations after the Second World War. And these we call the Julian Dalmatians because they come from Venezia Giulia, which is this part up here, and from Dalmatia, which is around here. So from Venezia Giulia, from the peninsula of Istria, from the city of Fiume, which is right here, from the islands in the Gulf of Bonaire, and we say Dalmatia, but we mean just a few cities, such as Zara, that were majority Italian population at that time. These are people who are on the border of several cultures. If you think back to the map, you can see that they are Italians, definitely, and they're culturally Italian, but there are very strong German influences because for 100 years they were under the government of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there were Germans emigrating there over the centuries. Strong Slavic influences because there were a lot of Slavic populations that immigrated into that area from about the 6th and 7th century on. Strong Hungarian influence because they were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and many of these coastlines were in fact the Riviera that Hungary thought when Hungarians went to the sea. And we must not forget that there was a small but very important Jewish community in these areas, primarily in the major cities of Trieste and Fiume, but absolutely important Jewish community. So a very multicultural area, a very multi-ethnic area, and you see that reflected in family names of people from the area. Follo, for example, we have Adriana and Mary Follo listening in today, members of the Giuliano Dalmati Club here in Toronto. Kmet family, Sergio Kmet. Bosic, we have listening in today. Grohovac, I don't know if he's listening in or not, but these are all names that are peculiar to the area, and they reflect Follo the Italian, Kmet the German, Bosic the Slavic, Grohovac the Hungarian side of our population. And as you can well imagine, they spoke various languages at home. Primarily, all of them spoke, sorry about that, somebody inadvertently is calling me. Most of them, all of them spoke the Istro-Venetian dialect that's peculiar to the area. All of them also spoke Italian. Many of them spoke German or Slovenian or Croatian or Hungarian or Yiddish if they were Jews from Northern Europe, or Judeo-Venetian if they were Jews from Italy. If you look at that area today, you'll see that the place names reflect that multi-ethnic aspect of the region. The city of Fiume has always been called Fiume. It was Flumen in Latin back in ancient times, Fiume during the Venetian and Italian period. Today it's called Rijeka. And right across from Rijeka, on the other side of the little river that's there, the Eneo, there's the town of Susak. That's the Italian spelling for it. But the Slavic spelling has only one S with a little line over the second S. And there's place names that people use normally in my hometown. There's a beach that's called Zalic, which is the Slavic word for pebbles. So it's a pebble beach. We call it Zalic. We see that multi-ethnicity, obviously, in the cuisine. Pretty well everybody in the area knows how to make crostoli, which are those deep fried Christmas cookies or ribbons. In other parts of Italy, they're called chiacchiere or galani. We call them crostoli. And pretty well everybody likes German sauerkraut in the area, with sausages, obviously. And we all adore the Slavic cevapcici, the little strips of ground beef with onion and so forth that we barbecue. And we drink vino, but we also drink rakia, which is the Slavic high-ended high spirits, such as grappa and so forth. So in all aspects of the people from the region, we see this fusion of many cultures, many ethnicities, various cuisines and languages. It's not unusual for people to speak fluently several languages there. Who are these Dalmatians, these Istriani Dalmatians, these Julian Dalmatians? We're very proud of our people, going back to antiquity and coming up to the very modern days. We offer the emperor to ancient Rome, Diocletian, who was born in the third century of the Common Era in 244 in Salona, Dalmatia. If you go down his palace, Split is the modern term name for Spalato. One of our native sons is Saint Jerome, born in Strido Dalmatie, and nobody really knows where that is. Some people place it up here in Upper Croatia, some places along the coast, but basically historians don't know where the heck Strido Dalmatie was. Saint Jerome is famous because he translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate edition of the Bible, the vernacular language of the ancient Roman Empire. And that's the standard edition of the Bible that the Roman Catholic Church uses to this very day, the Latin Vulgate. Very, very important for religion, for philosophy, for theology, for everything. Marco Polo was born on the island of Curzala in Dalmatia. He was born there in 1254. Venice acquired that island 2 years earlier. And the Polo family, which was Venetian, his father was an administrator in Venice, moved to the island. And 2 years after Venice acquired the island and the Polo family moved there, Marco was born there. Clearly a Venetian, born on a Venetian island in 1254. But today the Croatians call him Marco with a K, Pilic, and they claim that he's a Croatian. So that's fine. We'll let him do that. But in fact, he was a Venetian and an Italian. You may not have thought of Captain George von Trapp. If you've seen The Sound of Music, you know all about him. But the film is a film and it's fiction. The man may have been Austrian, but he was born in Zara which at that time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born there in 1880. He was born in Zara, grew up in Zara. He studied there, and then he became a naval sea captain, and he moved to Pola to take on his command. So the whole story about George von Trapp is basically a Dalmatian story, but you would never get that idea if you watch the movie The Sound of Music. But I thought I would correct that for you. More recent and living people that you might have heard of were Dalmatian or Istriani, Mario Andretti, the race car driver, born in Montona, Istria. I think many of you might have heard of Lidia Bastianic, the Emmy Award winner, famous cook based in New York. She was born in 1947 in Pola. Ottavio Missoni, the fashion designer, he died recently. He was an Olympic hurdler for Italy, born in Ragusa, today known as Dubrovnik. All three of them refugees, political refugees from Istria and Dalmatia, who settled first in Italy, and then Mario Andretti and Bastianic moved to North America. Ottavio Missoni made a fortune and stayed in Italy. You probably never knew that Michael Bublé has got Eastern and Dalmatian origins. His paternal grandfather is from Trau in Dalmatia. Today it's known as Trogir. And the Bubel family is actually from the hometown where I was born, Piccolo. So he's got Dalmatian roots, though he was born here in Canada, I believe. Sergio Marchionne, a very famous economist and businessman, died recently, was born in Italy, in Chieti, but his mother was a refugee from Carnizza in Istria. And so there's a lot of Giuliano Dalmati in Canada, in the United States, not all of them famous like the ones I mentioned, but they are part of the Italian immigrant community. They are, however, different from the general Italian immigrant community because they came out of their homeland, their hometowns, as refugees, as exiles. Many of them actually were officially declared refugees. They went to the International Refugee Organization and were helped by them. Others just became voluntary exiles and left, as my family did, on legal papers. We were we had passports. We left with our passports, but many of them were refugees without passports, without papers, profughi in Italian, or esuli. And they carry a huge burden of history, which other Italian regions, immigrants from other Italian regions, do not necessarily carry that burden of history. They may carry a burden of economy because they came as poor people looking for work. The Giuliano Dalmati came as exiles, as refugees, looking for a homeland as well as work. What is that burden of history? It's the consequence of World War II. When Italy surrendered to the Allies in September of 1943, for 2.5 years, for 2 years, from September of 43 till the April, May of 45, Istria, Venezia Giulia, Istria, and Dalmatia suffered through many invasions, different armies. The Italian, the Nazis came in, then the Croatian fascists came in, then the Serbian royalists came in, eventually the Yugoslav communists came in. In 1943-45, Marshal Tito's Yugoslav communist partisans were able to seize all of Istria, as well as the cities of Zara, halfway down the coast, Fiume, just under in the little corner under Istria, and Trieste on the opposite side of Istria. They seized those cities, and In some cases, Zara Fiume kept them. In the case of Trieste, they were there for 40 days, and then the Allies obliged them to leave. During the time that the Yugoslav partisan communists were occupying this territory, and basically from September of 43 through February of 47, but extending even further, there was a lot of violence, state-sponsored, partisan-sponsored violence against the Italian population in the area. Most of which, not all of it, but most of which had been there for centuries, if not millennia. There had been some Italian immigration in the 1920s and 30s when this area was part of fascist Italy. But the majority of the Italian population had been there since time immemorial. The kind of violence that was perpetrated has been epitomized recently in a film that came out a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago, called Rosso Istria, dubbed in English as Red Land. And it's the story of a university student from the University of Padua who was born and raised in Istria and was doing a thesis on Istrian culture when in 1943 the communist partisans arrested her and, to make a long story short, killed her. And she became a martyr alongside many thousands of other Italians. But she has become emblematic of the story of the communist partisan, ethnic cleansing, some people would say, of Italians from Istria, Dalmatia, trying to scare Italians to leave the land. And they were basically successful, as I'm going to say in a few moments. If you get a chance, you can put Red Land, Rosso Istria on Google, and you come up with a couple of short 4 or 5 minute previews of the film. Very rough, very tragic. If we had time at the end, if you're so inclined, we can watch one of them, but I'm not going to do it now. So many of these Italians were killed by being marched up to these holes in the ground. The region of Istria is karstic, so the rock is very porous and it has a lot of holes in it that go down deep into the ground 100, 200 meters. And so what the partisans did is they brought the prisoners that they had condemned to death to the edge of the holes, tied them up in twos with barbed wire or with wire, and they would shoot the first person in the head, who would then fall down the hole and drag the other person living into the hole. So half of them were shot and killed. The other half died a long and painful death after having fallen 100, 200 meters down into the crevice. A very terrible way of killing people. Any way of killing people is terrible, but this was particularly gruesome. There are stories that the partisans would then throw some dogs into the hole so that the dogs, going mad and ravenous, would further torture those people who had somehow or other survived the fall and were dying of hunger or broken bones and other causes. The Allies were able to stop this at a certain point, and with the help of the local population, they were able to exhume many of the bones, many of the corpses. We see them here. We see people holding their nose. They have masks, gas masks, because of the putrefying bodies. Some of these boibes, such as the one here in Basovizza, have been turned into monuments. They've been cemented over and a monument in memory of the victims has been placed there, but most of the foibe in what is now Slovenia and Croatia are still not, what's the term, rendered sacred by memorialization. So they are sites that of torture that need to be recognized. Now, after the war, with Italy's surrender in 43, the victory in the war in 45, and then with the Treaty of Paris in 1947, Italy had hoped to be able to maintain its pre-1945 borders, but in fact it could not. It had to cede Venezia Giulia, all of Istria, the city of Fiume, the islands in the Gulf of the Quarner, and all its holdings along the Dalmatian archipelago and the territories it held, the towns and cities it held along the coast of Dalmatia. It had to cede them all to the new Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia as part of its war reparations to that country, because Italy had invaded Yugoslavia, because Italy had seized parts of Yugoslavia, because Italy had treated the Yugoslav or the Slavic population in its areas badly. So there were a lot of reasons that were produced to excuse, to support this concession of territory to Yugoslavia as war reparations. This meant that the Italian population had to leave or could stay and become Yugoslavs. As I mentioned earlier, the Italian population was suffering from persecution, summary trials and executions, and many of them, out of fear for their own safety, or because they just did not want to live in a communist dictatorship, picked up all they had and left. The iconic exodus was in February 1947 from the city of Pola. I show you a photo from that moment here. But there had already been an exodus starting in 1943 of people walking, taking the train, going to Italy any which way they could. My mother's brother in 1945 fled on a sailboat from our native island and crossed the Adriatic. He just one day sailed out and never came back. And many, many people did the same from the islands and ended up in places like Rimini or Ancona on the eastern side of the Adriatic, on Italy's western coast. If you look at this image, you see the husband and wife with the cart and all the belongings they could carry with them. They have clearly abandoned their home. Many people left the doors open, or they left the keys in the door, knowing that their apartment, their house will be taken up by Slavic populations that the partisans and Tito's Yugoslav government had already rounded up, picked up from the mainland, and were bringing to replenish the population in these cities on the coast. If you look at the picture, you can also see signs like the W. W in Italian, such as W Tito, WCPL. W in Italian is a short form for long to live, viva, vivat in Latin. So vivat, long live Tito, Marshal Tito, the leader of the communist, Yugoslav communist partisans, or vivat CPL, the communist, the Committee of Partisan Liberation, Comitato Partigiano di Liberazione. If you put the W upside down, it stands for down with, the opposite of long live. We cannot see what's written here, but you can just guess that it says something like down with fascism, or down with Italians, or down with Mussolini, things of that sort. Mussolini was long dead by now, but those scripts were there. I remember going to my hometown in 1967, and then in 1972, and then in 1980. And some of these scripts on the wall were still there 20 years later. If you look at the statistics, you realize just how huge this exodus was. From the city of Fiume, which had a population of 60,000, 54,000 left, 90% of the population. From Pola, 32,000 out of 34,000 left, 94%. From Zara, 95% left. From Capodistria, which today is known as Koper, 93% left. From Rovigno, which today is known as Rovigny, 80% left. In all, we calculate grosso modo about 350,000 people fled from Istria. Today, there's only about 30,000 Italians in Istria. The population has bounced back to 350,000 or thereabouts, actually probably more, but the difference is made up by the Slavic population that has come in to the area. Interestingly, during the Exodus, there were also many Slavs that left because they simply did not want to live under a communist dictatorship. Where did they go? Well, they went to Italy, but Italy was destitute and could not do anything for them except to place them in refugee camps. These were, after all, refugees. Many of them had gone through the International Refugee Organization. Italy set up 119 different refugee camps across the entire peninsula and also on the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. One of the biggest one was in Fertilia, a little town on the western shore of Sardinia, literally as far away as you can get from Istria and Dalmatia. They placed them here, or in Cagliari, or in Termini Imerese, in Cibali, down in Sicily, as well as down here, around Naples, in Tuscany, primarily because they did not want them massing up along the border with the new Federalist Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, for fear that they might be a fifth force, a fifth element that could serve as a threat to Yugoslavia, but also as a danger for Italy. Many of the leaders of the refugees were actually campaigning in Rome with the Italian government to set up new cities, to help them establish new cities in Friuli up here, so as to be close to their homelands. But the Italian government simply would not allow it. So you can see how the population was spread out throughout the peninsula. And this has led to what the Italian government wanted, the eventual watering down of the political force of these refugees. And it's leading also to the eventual reduction, destruction, if you want, of the culture of the Giuliano-Dalmati. The culture still survives in bits and pieces with the 30,000 Italians that are left here who are carrying on. But they, like the exiles in Italy and those who went abroad, by marrying with the new populations that they have next door, are slowly but surely marking the end of that Giuliano-Dalmata culture that was there before. Life in the refugee camps was hard. This is a photo of the camp in Laterina, Tuscany. There were 21 shacks. You can see them here. Basically, these were prisoner of war shacks. But the war was finished, the prisoners were gone, the Giuliano-Dalmati were placed in there. If they were not placed in shacks and baracconi that had previously been used as prisoners of war camps, they were placed in military barracks. such as the one in La Spezia in Liguria, the Ugo Botti barracks. And here what they did is it was a nice building, a barracks, but they were sectioned off into very small cubes, as you can see here. This would be a family's kitchen. You can just visualize how small the places were and how difficult it was to live there. The idea of returning to Istria and Dalmatia to Fiume was just impossible. In the 1940s and 50s, even up to the 60s, return was basically impossible. That's why we refer to these people as exiles. It was impossible because back in Yugoslavia, the people who had left were all deemed to have been fascists and now traitors to what was called the workers' paradise, which is what Yugoslavia called itself, and Italian communists in Italy referred to Yugoslavia as il paradiso dei lavoratori, workers' paradise. So for people who, like my mother's brother, fled secretly in a sailboat or walked quietly across the border, for them to return to Yugoslavia after having fled, they were quite possibly facing jail sentences, and some of them could possibly have been facing execution as fascists, as traitors, or for crimes, real or invented, with, with which they would have been charged. So my mother's brother never, ever, ever went back. He had spent the war years working as an orderly in a Red Cross ship, an Italian Red Cross ship. So for him to go back, he could have been seen as an Italian soldier and a traitor and a fascist, because he never went back. Many people did not want to go back because they were now in Italy, or they had emigrated to the United States or to Canada or to Australia. And they were now wanting to live in a free democratic republic, such as Italy, such as the United States. And the idea of going back into a communist dictatorship was just not viable. Another reason why they would not have wanted to go back was that the area, as I suggested earlier, had been heavily repopulated with Slavic populations. And so the language had changed. People in the streets, in the stores, at the office were no longer speaking Italian. They were speaking what was then called Serbo-Croatian. And these new people who had come in had changed the names of the geography. So the city of Fiume had been renamed Rijeka, which is a literal translation of the Italian word fiume, meaning river. Rijeka means river in the local Slavic dialect of Croatian. Capodistria had been renamed Koper, and people themselves have been renamed. So many Italian Giovanna, my mom's baptismal name is Giovanna, but on her workbook from when she lived there under the communist regime, her name is Ivanka, not Giovanna. So my mom's name was changed, and many other Giovanna were called Ivanka, and Giovanni, Ivan. Giacomo became Jacob, and so forth. So people themselves were obliged to Slavicize their names, which basically is what Italians did with the Slavs in the 1920s and 30s, forcing many of them to Italianize their Slavic name. So it's a bit of a quid pro quo that was going on there. Nonetheless, people did not like it, just like the Slavic did not like it in the 1920s and 30s. So many refugees who remained in Italy, excuse me, unable to do anything in Italy because there was no work. Italy was destitute after the Second World War, had to emigrate. Most of them went to the United States, to Canada, and to Australia, the three major Anglo emigrations to Anglo countries. And many of them went to Latin America, in particularly to Venezuela, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Those people who went abroad see their migration to English or Spanish-speaking countries as their second exodus. They had been forced to leave their hometowns in Istria and Dalmatia. That was their first exodus, but then Italy could not do anything for them, and so they had to leave Italy as well. Most of them, ironically, left with the ships owned by the Kozulich line. Kozulich is the name of a major shipbuilding family, originally from my native island of Lucin, from my native town of Lucin Piccolo. But the family opened up shipbuilding yards in Trieste, and in Venice, and in Genoa. So they had become a very major shipbuilding family. And two ships that they had built, the Saturnia and the Vulcania, were major ferries of Julian Dalmatian immigrants to North and South America. I mentioned the International Refugee Organization. Quite a number of refugees who escaped from Yugoslavia had very little documentation to show who they were. Most of them, like my mother, would have never asked for an Italian passport because they had been living in Italy and had no idea of leaving Italy. They were not about to travel abroad. So when the area became Yugoslavia, they did not have an Italian passport that they could have used to get out. So they left without papers, and they went to the International Refugee Organization offices and were given an identity paper. I found this one on the web, and it's very interesting. Obviously, the form has been filled out. There's a picture, there's a stamp, there's a signature. It's the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, Italian mission. Notice that the intake center is in Gorizia, which is literally on the border with Yugoslavia, now on the border with Slovenia. It's dated the 22nd of November, 1949, serial number 7013. This is to certify, notice what it says, this is to certify that the refugee whose photograph is attached registered today, 22 November 1949, at Gorizia Intake Center and declared himself to be Rusic Amedeo, so that's his last name, Rusic. The ICH ending is typical of names with a Slavic origin from this area, but Amedeo is clearly an Italian name. He claims himself to have been born in Fiume on the 11th of July, 1921. And then it says, of undetermined nationality. The people at the IRO office don't know what nationality to put down for him. He probably says he's Italian, but his hometown is now Yugoslavia. Fiume is now Rijeka. And he doesn't have any papers. And so they just put down undetermined nationality. He said WOP, without papers. And he is presently domiciled. He lives in Fiume, Veneto, this town in the Veneto region. So he signs his name here, Rusic Amedeo, and the official of the IRO signs his name there. So Amedeo Rusic, I discovered, emigrated to Canada. Oh, sorry, I think I've jumped. Okay, I'm going in the wrong direction here. Let me go back.
Oh.
So I found out that Amedeo Rusic emigrated to Canada, like so many other, and he came through
21.
year 21. He became a Canadian citizen. I found him listed in the voters list for Essex County in Ontario. I found out on the web that he passed away in 1981 at the age of 60. And that when he died, he was survived by his wife, Ilde, and their 3 children. Notice the name Ilde. She's probably a German. She might have been a Giuliano Dalmata with a German name, but in Google, I could not find out her last name or more about her. But certainly this Amedeo Rusic was a lucky find and a very interesting case of exile, a refugee, a stateless person who comes to Canada as a stateless person with stamped refugee on it. What did they do once they got to Canada? Well, they built a great new life for themselves. They're all very happy. This is a extended family of one of the club members in our club, Giuliano Dalmata, in Toronto. There's a photo I took at our annual picnic some years ago. And there he is. He's the member here. This is his wife. These are all of his Giuliano Dalmata relatives. He's a member as well. He's a member. And they come with their children to the picnic. So a nice, big, happy family. You look at them, and some of them look very Italian. And other ones, like this little kid here, looks very German to me. That brings out the multi-ethnic, multicultural aspect that I was mentioning before. What did they contribute to Canada? When they arrived in the early 1950s, mostly, they came on a contract. They had to do the work that Canada told them to do by contract for 1 or 2 years, depending on the contract. Many of them were sent to work on railroads, building the CN Canadian Pacific or the Canadian National Rail Lines.
So
Some of
that
them
is
went
it.
to work on forests. Some of them went to work in mines or in factories. Some became writers and journalists. Now I've got them, and one of them is Gianni Angelo Grohovaz, who came over in 1951, worked for a while in the railroads and in the forests in Muskoka, and then moved to Toronto, got married, had children, and became a journalist and a writer in Toronto. Mario Giuliani actually is not an exile, is not a refugee. He actually came out of Istria before World War II and emigrated to Canada, Montreal in 1939. But he too became a journalist in Montreal, writing in French and in Italian. I'll talk about these two later. I'll talk about Claudio Antonelli as well. He is a refugee living in Montreal. He was a librarian all of his life, but also a writer. And then there are people who are second. Jenny Gunn, who was born in Trieste and not a refugee, not an exile, but a Triestinian, which makes her a Juliana. And she's now a very famous Canadian writer living in Vancouver. Katerina Edwards was born in England of a refugee mother and is now a very famous Italian-Canadian writer living in Edmonton. Oops, sorry. Some of them became artists. Vittorio Fiorucci is an exile from Zara. He moved to Montreal, became a graphic artist, and I'll show you some of his stuff later. A very important prize-winning artist. Silvia Picota, who may be online listening in, she said she would come in, is born here in Canada of a Zaratino, a Zara refugee, and a very successful, also prize-winning artist. Some of them became athletes. Second generation Monica Kovacci, her father is a refugee, was an Olympic gymnast for Canada. Joseph Katarinic, also a refugee. He became a major hockey figure, a hockey player. I cannot remember, I think for the Maple Leafs. Some of them became university professors. Diego Bastianuti, a refugee from Fiume. Myself, not a refugee. I came out with passport, but nonetheless, I'm here. Gabriele Erasmi from Trieste, not a refugee, but Carlo Fonda, a refugee. Sandra Parmigiani, who's online, not a refugee, but an immigrant from Trieste. Alexandra Stoyanovich, also a refugee, also an immigrant, not a refugee, but her parents, her grandparents, grandfather is from Lucene. Some of them became entrepreneurs. So Sergio Marchione, who was born in Italy of a refugee mother, eventually moved to Canada. And his mother, who died recently, lived in Toronto. And he was educated here in Toronto. And you probably know him as the CEO of Fiat Chrysler. Some of the women in the group were recognized MAC Cosmetics. Well, the founder of MAC Cosmetics, Frank Toscan, the blonde fellow here with his sister Julie, is the son of refugees. He himself was born in Italy, I believe. And Julie, I believe, was born in Canada. But their mother and their mother and their late father were members of our club. Their mother still is a wonderful, wonderful woman, well into her 90s, but full of life and vitality and with a good head on her shoulders. And her two children are absolutely phenomenal. There are two other children, but these are the two whose photos I had. Those who were in Toronto founded a club in 1967, the Club Giuliano Dalmato, and started a bunch of various activities to keep the community in Toronto united. Annual picnics, dinner dances, exhibitions. They set up exhibitions, book presentations, and so forth. They set up plaques. One of the first plaques they set up is this one here in 1991 on the pillar, one of the outdoor pillars of the Columbus Center in Toronto. They also set up a plaque at Pier 21 in Halifax, and a group of Giuliano Dalmati in Chatham, Ontario, the Lega Istriana di Chatham, Ontario, actually brought in and put a plaque in one of the parks in Chatham. So they're trying to make their presence known here in Canada. But because of their surnames, their ethnicity, their culture, because of where they came, they're often not immediately recognizable as Italians. Guido Bosic, whose widow is listening in today, his papers say that he comes from Strujan, Slovenia, but in fact he came from Strugnano. That's what the town was known when he was born there under Italy. My friend Elio Klapčić in New Jersey, his papers say he's born in Boljun, Croatia, but when he was born, it was Bolzano, Italy. Egone Ratzenberger, a very important intellectual in Italy, his papers say he's born in Rijeka, Croatia, but he's actually from Fiume, that's Rijeka today. Livio Stuparic, a musician here in Toronto, recently deceased, his paper said he was born in Crnica, but Slovenia, but actually Karvica, Italy. So it's not easy to realize, or it's easy not to realize, it's easy to forget that these people are Italians if you go by their names or what it says on their identity papers. And that's why in my book, I called the book Forgotten Italians, Julian Dalmatian. It's a book that focuses on writers and artists in Canada. And here's Silvia Pecota, Gianangelo Grovaz, Diego Bastianuti, and Caterina Edwards, who are four of the several people in the book. I mentioned Mario Giuliani. He was born in 1985 in Pisino d'Istria, in what was at that time Austria. It was part of Austria. He grew up being educated in Italian and German. He left at the age of 19. He went to Milan. He got a job there as assistant journalist. And then he moved to Paris, where he worked as a journalist in Paris. And in Paris, he met the son of a major Montreal newspaper owner who invited him to come to Montreal. So in 1936, he came to Montreal to work as a journalist. He wrote plays in Italian and in French and had them mounted. He was involved in theater in Milan, in Paris, and now in Montreal. And some people think that he might have been a fascist spy. He was interred in Petawawa, Ontario in 1940 and arrested and interned. And what's really important about his internment, about him, is that he wrote in French a novel about his internment experience. And it was published in French in 1945. The title is La Ville sans femme. He himself translated it in Italian the following year, added a chapter to it in Italian, La città senza donne. And then very recently, in the late 1990s, Antonio Mazza translated it into English as The City Without Women. It's a very important novel because it is the first novel to speak about the internment of Italians in Canada, which is a very, very important topic for Italian Canadians and Canadian history. There's a wonderful article by Elisabetta Carraro, who just defended her PhD here at the University of Toronto. There's a wonderful article in my book, Forgotten Italians. Her article is two images of internet, Mario Giuliani and Vincenzo Poggi. She parallels the stories narrated by Mario Giuliani in his book with some of the paintings by Vincenzo Poggi, who was a Milanese Italian who had been arrested and interned in Petawawa alongside with all the other Italians. And he painted. And I wish I could show you some of the images, but they're under copyright by the Canadian War Museum. So you need to either go look at my book where I got permission to print them, or go on the web and look for Vincenzo Poggi and put down internment or something of that sort. And you will find these really interesting images of internees and life during the internment. My absolutely favorite author, because I've worked on him, is Gianni Angelo Grochovac, born in 1926, the same year as my mom, died of a heart attack unexpectedly in 1988. He was born in Fiume, today Rijeka, and died here on the shores of Lake Huron in Tiny Township, and he's buried there. He's famous, very important for Italian-Canadian community in Canada as a journalist, as an activist on behalf of Italian workers, as a poet, as a novelist. He held many jobs. And in fact, he gave a talk at what was then Arundel College, and today is the University of Toronto at Mississauga, in which he says in this talk, which was published by Roberto Buranello in his article in my collection, Forgotten Italians, so you can go and read the whole thing there. He says, then they asked me what my job is. Well, modesty aside, I always listened to my father, who said to me, once you have mastered a skill, put it aside. So in Italy, this is what I did. Bank clerk, soldier, stock boy, typist, journalist, teacher, fisherman, and doorman. In Canada, things get complicated. Lumberjack, railway worker, accountant, interpreter, cement worker, carpenter, mechanic, dishwasher, car washer, electrician's assistant, social worker, administrator, head of personnel, co-editor and editor-in-chief, night watchman, club president, vice president of a dairy, private investigator, union organizer, archivist, journalist, poet, writer, unemployed. Fascinating, the sort of jobs that he, but so many other immigrants had to take just to make ends meet, just to find a footing for themselves in the new country. He was a radio host and a community leader. He had a radio program on CHIN radio, and eventually he published a collection of some of his radio editorials as a book titled E con rispetto parlando e al microfono Gianni Grochovac. With all due respect, at the microphone, Gianni Grochovac. When there was a big earthquake in Friuli in 1976, if I remember correctly, he wrote a book about Canada's contribution to the rebuilding of Friuli, to Friuli from Canada with love. He wrote a collection of poems, Fiuman dialect. The title of the collection is Per ricordar le cose che ricordo, to remember the things that I remember. And it's very important because it's a collection of poetry about the memory of places where you are not anymore and where you cannot go back. There is no nostos, no return. So there's a lot of nostos, nostalgia for these places. I would like to give you one just so you can see it. I'm afraid that the students may not be able to understand the dialect. So what I'll do, I'll go along it, but I'll translate it off the top of my head for you. The young girl has left for Australia, the young man for Latin America. After the war, everything changed. Uh, the fatherland, the motherland, and religion went to hell in a basket. The people who were leaving for Italy believed that they were going away on a holiday. The old people, alone, without any hope anymore, went to the cemetery of St. Michael to say hello to the dead. In fact, in the cemetery in Kozala, the grandmothers met each other after lunch with a bundle of flowers in their arms, flowers for the dead, a tear, a sign of the cross, a caress. Where are you going, Mrs. Erminia? To Naples. And you? I've got a son in Venice. Oh, look at what sadness. We're having to leave the dead ones behind. My heart bleeds. My heart sheds tears. But our rags in two bundles, the suitcase tied up with rope, a whole bunch of worries. The exile leaves for a long exile, leaving behind himself, his own fireplace. Milan, Chiavari, Venice, or in Friuli, in refugee camps. This is something more than a Calvary. These are people who ask God for a little bit of peace, of work, of respect. What do you mean? It's all old stuff left up in the attic among the old rags that are of no longer of any use. The first stop, and then came the International Refugee Organization. And around the world, spread throughout the world, we are working as servants, slaving away. The young woman is a servant down in Australia. The young man digs holes in Peru. A very interesting poem, I find, that talks about the departure, leaving things behind, leaving the dead behind, and then ending up in servitude, working as in servile jobs as a servant or as a digger far away. One of the more interesting things he wrote is that this semi-autobiographical novel, a narrative of his first year in Canada. He does it with a fictitious main character, but it's clearly a lot of autobiographical material in there, working under contract with the Canadian National Railway in Northern Ontario, Muskoka. This is an important book because it's a document of the early Italian migration into Canada, presented as a literary narrative, but also very strongly autobiographical in so many aspects. Diego Bastianut, and it's the second novel, basically, I should say, it's the second novel to come out of an Italian in Canada. The first one was Giuliani, and talking about internment. The second one is Grohovats, talking about working as a migrant worker, basically, an immigrant worker. Diego Bastianutti, a scholar, a professor emeritus from Queen's University. He's a poet and activist, social activist, currently living in Burnaby, British Columbia, originally from Fiume. He was a IRO refugee, came to the United States without papers as a IRO refugee, eventually became an American citizen, educated there, got a PhD in Toronto in Spanish, and then got a job at Queen's University teaching Spanish and Italian. After he retired, he became a Canadian. After he retired, he moved with his wife to Vancouver because that's where the children had moved to, so to be close to the family. His first book of poetry in Italian is called Il punto caduto, the dropped stitch, where he talks about how he feels like a sweater with a dropped stitch. Something's not right in there. The second book he published, again in Italian, collection of poetry, is titled La barca in secco, the boat in dry dock. Again, an emblem of this idea that he's not in the right place. The boat should be in water, not in dry dock. And that's how he feels himself. He then did a bilingual book. It's self-translated. On one side, you have the poem in Italian, on the other, the poem in English. Per un pugno di terra, for a fistful of soil. Again, a very evocative title. And then the fourth collection of poetry is all in English, The Bloody Thorn, something that pulls into you and very emblematic of what he feels like being a refugee. I thought I would read to you the poem that gives the title to the book, Il punto caduto, the dropped stitch. I don't remember if I understood, not even if I thought about it. I only know that I wanted to take part in life. These are the rules, they told me. This is the matrix. Follow it and you'll be happy. So I too would have knitted my sweater, and so I started to knit, knitting point by point, knit by knit, line by line. I never took my eyes off it. The day came when I wrapped myself in my sweater. But look at what happened. It all came undone because who knows how, who knows when, a stitch had dropped. Very emblematic of how he feels being a 13-year-old exile arriving in the United States, not knowing the language, the culture, the people, or nothing. Claudio Antonelli, the name originally was Antonaz, but it was Italianized to Antonelli, was born in Pisino d'Istria. He's now living in Montreal. He spent his life as a librarian in Montreal, but he's also a writer and a historian. He's the brother of the very famous Italian actress Laura Antonelli, who died a few years back, but one of the great beauties of Italian cinema in the 1950s and 60s. He has published several books. The two that I want to point to you is this one, Fedeli all'Istria Fiume Dalmazia, Faithful to Istria Fiume Dalmatia, Us Refugee Immigrants. It's a collection of short thoughts, short 2-3 page long stories about what he feels like being a refugee, an immigrant, and what his relationship is with Istria, with Fiume, with Dalmatia. And another book he wrote afterwards is this one, Sradicamento, Partenza, Identità, Uprooting Belonging, Identity, Pisino, Naples, Montreal, and elsewhere. The story of his own life. Here he is with his mother and his sister, Laura Antonella, and the chicken that the mother is holding. So again, trying to come to grips with the exile experience, the refugee experience. Aldo Nazarco, who's online with us today, born in Fiume in 1937. I don't know, Aldo, if I should have said that. Immigrant to Canada. Recently published a book of memories about his life as an adolescent in Fiume, and then his passage through 10 different refugee camps until he came to Canada and moved to Port Arthur. That's the old name. It's now Thunder Bay. And Aldo now lives in Victoria, British Columbia, where he used to have a radio program on the University of Victoria radio station. So here we see him at the console. If you'd like to read his book, you need to get in touch with him. Caterina Edwards, very important Italian-Canadian writer, prize winner. One of again, I said it earlier, born in Earl's Barton, United Kingdom, currently living in Edmonton. She's a second generation. Her mother is from the island of Lucine. One of her earliest books is a collection of a short story called Island of the Nightingales. It's the first thing I read by her, a bunch of short stories. The short story that gives the title to the book, Island of the Nightingales, actually talks about herself going back to her mother's island of Lucine for the summer and trying to understand the local population, coming to know her aunts and uncles who have stayed behind, making friends with the new generation of Slavic Lucinian people who also speak a little bit of Italian, and so they can communicate. More recently, she published a book called Finding Rosa. She writes in English, I should say, which is about the story of Caterina having to deal with her mother's Alzheimer's and dementia and trying to come to grips with the stories that her mother discover and come to grips with the stories that her mother never told her about her mother's own biography. So the secrets that her mother, an immigrant, a refugee, an exile, kept within herself and would not talk. So that book has now been translated into Italian. It's won prizes. Caterina has presented it all over Canada, including at our club here in Toronto, and has presented the Italian edition of it at the University of Venice, in Turin, at the International Book Fair there. And she's encountering quite a lot of success with it. Do I have time? I've gone on way too long. I'll skip this. Jenny Gunn, immigrant from Trieste, not a refugee, not an exile. Hoover. Vittorio Fiorucci, he's a refugee from Zara, award-winning, spent his life in Montreal, where he died. Some of his artwork is fascinating. He was hired by the Green Movement, Ne coupez pas les arbres. I like the sense of humor. And by the tourism of Quebec in the 1960s, Visiter le Nouveau Quebec. And the Nouveau Quebec is a priest who's been decapitated. For opera, Rigoletto, I love this. Or for operetta, The Merry Widow by Franz Lehár. But you might know him best because he's the one who invented Victor, the little mascot for the Juste pour rire, just for laughs comedy series. Silvia Pecota, excellent, fantastic artist, multimedia, living in Kingston. Her father is from Zara. She's Canadian-born, photographer, but very many other arts. She did the monument for the Afghan and Peacekeeper Memorial that's in Windsor, and another copy of it in Kandahar in Iraq. A rich heritage, significant contributions to Canada, a history worth preserving. How do we preserve it? How do we make it known? One thing I'm trying to do is I've launched a book series called Arpa d'Or. The term comes from the hymn of the Hebrew slaves in Verdi's opera Nabucco, where it says, "Golden harp of our prophetic poets, why so silent you hang from the willow? Reawaken the memories in our hearts. Speak to us of a time that once was." And I think this line, "speak to us of a time that once was," is what we need to do. We need to talk about the immigration experience, the emigration experience. Even if you're not a Giuliano Dalmata, even if you're the child of Sicilian immigrants to Canada, get your earlier generation or your own self to write about, to memorialize, to document what it is like to have been an immigrant to Canada or the child of immigrants to Canada. Diego Bastinuti wrote the first volume the second volume in this collection, his own autobiography. If you're interested, get in touch with me. Time is running short, so I'm going to just skip very quickly through it. My friend Rosanna Turchinovich-Jurichin wrote a book about a Jewish Holocaust survival, Miriam Greenglass Frankel, who was born in Kiev, which at that time was Czechoslovak Republic, but today is in Ukraine. So you can imagine what it's like with the question of borders in that area of the world. So she's born in what today is Ukraine, but she was raised in Trieste and speaks Italian. She even speaks the dialect, and she's an immigrant to Canada. So this is her survival stories. She survived Auschwitz, but lost all of her family in Auschwitz. And this year we published the story of Cherubino Colusi Corter, who was an Italian worker born on the island of Cherso when it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he stayed, but he was taken as a political prisoner and spent a few years in Goliotok, Bald Island, which is this island here, which is the horrible gulag that Marshal Tito had for his political opponents. Katerina Edwards, whom I mentioned earlier, is going to be publishing the next volume in our series called The Great Antonio, about Antonio Barichevich from Katerina's mother's hometown, Veliloshin, used to be Lusingrande. He came to Canada in the 1950s and worked as a strongman. So he was on television, he was doing feats of strength, he was extraordinarily strong, and he died absolutely destitute, penniless, and forgotten in Montreal. He died as a street person in Montreal. So a fascinating story. And later in 2024, we're going to publish Rosanna Turchinovich collection of stories about her own encounter with quite a number of Julian Dalmatians here in Canada. That book will come out late in 2024. So basically, documenting the history is the most important thing that I think I would like to get the students and the older people, my friends listening in tonight, to understand and to do something about, even if you manage to convince somebody else, an old relative, to jot down, write, tell your story, and get it up on the web, the University of Guelph website. They have a wonderful site there, or get it published as Aldo Nazarco did, or as Gianni Grohovaz did. These are really important documents about the Italian presence here in Canada. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Apologize for having gone on for way too long. But I had a lot to tell you. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sharing. Have I stopped sharing?
Yeah, you can. You should have a button on your end that says stop sharing. You can do that. And we can take questions now. I have to tell you two things, Konrad. First, that we did read the first two books of The City Without Women.
Nice.
in the translation, yes, when we talked about internment. And we also are going to be working next on ArcGIS. Each student will build their own, and topics will be on the topic you presented tonight. So we will be getting up some of these stories that you want to document onto the website at University of Guelph.
Excellent. Well, before I lose the floor, I just saw Grant Karchich image, and Grant has published a couple of interesting books. One of them is about the genealogy of the people from his island of Unia, which is right next to my own island. And I see Ida Marinzoli, who has not yet written a book, even though I've told her many times to do it, but she's written a lot of wonderful stories and short articles for the El Boletín, the newsletter of the Club Giuliano Dalmata. So Ida, who has a PhD from Rutgers, and has the
Wow.
skills to do this. I'm hoping we'll one day do more.
I'm sure I'm sure she will. That would be good to get a book from her as well. And if any of them or my students has any questions, you can raise your hand and speak directly to Conrad, or you can type it into the chat and I'll read it off. I don't see any questions yet, but while we're waiting for some questions, I wanted to maybe draw in Professor Parmigiani. I did not know that you were also part of this community. So that's
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah,
know if you
not a refugee and not an exile. I came because I went to learn. I always tell students I went to Germany. I wanted to learn German. I ended up in Canada. So when you go on exchange, you never know what happens, and that was my exchange. So it's yeah, it's a good adventure. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I don't
Well,
see
and
the
now you're here
chat.
at University of Guelph. How do you see chat?
I don't see the chat. Is it there?
Yeah, unless let me see.
Hmm.
Maybe if you maybe only my students can see it.
Oh, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe.
I don't
So
see the chat either.
you don't either? Okay. So my students can put any comments in chat, perhaps, and anyone else, raise your hands. I'll take questions.
Wonder if we have while we're waiting, maybe we could have Aldo Nazarco if he's still on.
Yeah, I see
Tell
him
us.
on. Aldo, do you want to?
Aldo, do you want to
You
tell
can
us
open.
something about yourself and your immigration experience? You need to unmute yourself, Aldo.
Yes. Am I on now?
Yes, we can
Yes.
hear you,
Yeah,
but we
yeah.
don't see you. Can you put?
I know, but I can't get my camera working. It says
Okay.
to click on something, but I can't. I don't see it at all. So yeah. Anyway, I certainly enjoyed the explanations. Very interesting, and mine is yeah. Of course, brought back an awful lot of memories. But the immigration, I tell you, one thing that I was very happy about was to regain my Italian citizenship, and that didn't happen until 1993, because according to the laws, before that time, anyone coming from the old Yugoslavia was not an Italian. We lost our Canadian citizens. We lost our Italian citizenship, and it was quite a struggle to regain it. And the reason I did it was because I was stubborn. On my on the passport, it said citizenship Yugoslav, born in Fiume, Yugoslavia, and I really hated that. And so it was a struggle to regain it, and I'm very happy about it. Yeah, you're right, Konrad. We went through 10 different refugee camps, and we were in the camps for 4 straight years, from 1947 to 1951. And
Did you
yeah,
emigrate Did you emigrate because of the International Refugee Organization?
yes,
Through them?
yes, yeah, we were international refugees. Yeah. And there was one problem when the first X-rays were taken. They always took X-rays at the camps. It showed that I had a spot in my lungs, and they thought there may be possibly TB. So I was sent to the Cava dei Tirreni. It was a sanatorium, and it turned out to be just a scar from pleurisy, apparently, when I was younger.
Oh,
And so that, and in a way, that was a lucky thing, because we were accepted to go to Australia, but because of my X-rays, we were refused. So after 6 months that I spent in a sanitarium, my father was hired by Ontario firm, Abitibi Power and Paper, to go work in the woods in North American. And so this is how we came to Canada by default.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Why were you transferred through 10 different refugee camps?
I have no idea. We went to Trieste, Udine, Novara, the Cinecittà in Rome, Capua, and then Bagnoli.
Well, you got to see Italy.
Oh yeah, I got to see it from from top to bottom. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. Oh, by the way, I do still have the show, the radio show.
Oh, you do still.
It.
Very good.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah,
Nice. Thank you,
yeah,
Aldo, for
yeah,
sharing that.
yeah.
Thank you.
And
I
I
do
should
have a
mention.
question. No, go ahead, Aldo.
No,
I have a question, but I'll after.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say, as far as I'll say famous or important people from Fiume. My second cousin was in the hockey on the Canadian hockey team for the Lake Placid Olympics in 1980.
Nice.
Yeah, Stelio Zupancic.
Zupancic. Yeah, that's good Italian name.
Yes. Oh, yes, it is.
Excellent.
You were going to ask something, Teresa?
Yes, there was a student in the class, David, who has a question from the earlier part of the talk. Was Dalmatia a part of the Venetian Empire? I gather Marco Polo wrote in an unusual combination of Italian and French. Is that the nature of the dialect of that area?
Well, the nature of the dialect is Venetian, of Venetian
Yeah,
origin.
I'll respond to that. Yes,
Mm.
Marco Polo wrote his famous book in this sort of French dialect, French language, while he was a prisoner in Genoa. And, that's right next door to France. At that time, French culture had a huge influence all across northern Italy. So it's not unusual to think of a Venetian who can actually write in early French, let's put it that way. So that would have been a language of educated people, because in Marco Polo's time, we really don't really have. I mean, Dante's just come out with his version of Tuscan, so there's a lot of debate about language.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Dalmatia was part of the Venetian Republic from about the 1200s on. Different parts became part of the Venetian Republic at different times. But on the whole, we can say that the coastline was Venetian and Italian. Of course, there would have been Slavic people there, but the majority would have been Venetian speaking or Italian speaking. I actually went down to Curzola with my friend Rosanna Giuricin and her husband. And it's fascinating when you're on the island of Curzola, it controls the passage. It's very close to shore. So ships have to go between Curzola and the mainland. So that's why Curzola becomes a strategically important city. But if you look from Curzola to the mainland, which is just a few miles over, the Dinaric Alps that run all down the coast of Dalmatia are so huge, so high, that you can see why Croatia looks the way it does today, or why the Ottomans, the Turks, were able to go in and conquer Serbia, Croatia, get to the gates of Vienna, but could not get into the Adriatic.
Yes.
Because they could not come over the mountains. The mountains are so high. So it's a geographical barrier that separated the north, which was Slavic and Muslim, from the seashore, which was Italian and Christian. So I would very much recommend a trip to Kurzola to anybody. The food is great. The land is wonderfully beautiful. The water is crystal clear. And you get these insights that you do not get reading a book. But when you stand there and you see it, you go, wow, now I understand. why the Ottomans got all the way to Vienna, but could not get anywhere near Venice.
Yeah. And you mentioned a composer. I can't remember, the name escapes me now earlier, that he was born in Dalmatia. But I don't know if you're familiar with the overture king, Franz von Zuppe.
Yeah.
The Poet and Peasant Overture and all of those.
Yeah.
Well, he's if you look him up, they always say he was Austrian, but the family was, I think, from Bergamo.
He was born in Austria, but that time it was Dalmatia.
Yes, he was born in Spalato in Split.
There's a question from Paul Buxa. Hi, Paul. Good to see you.
To see you. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. You mentioned earlier about the Azzurri sometimes being viewed as fascists. I wonder if that still lingers today, because I know with the Giornata della Memoria in February, sometimes there's some of that feeling that still seems to linger.
Yeah. When I've been to Italy, I've been there a couple of times for the Giornata della Memoria commemorations. Officially, the Azzurri are not seen as fascists. And I think the majority of the population has now been educated enough to realize that. However, there's some diehard communist cells or very left-wing cells. The remnants of the diehard Communist Party, let me put it that way, that still see the whole exodus as a fascist exodus. And they have to, because otherwise they cannot explain why what they did, which was very much anti-Italian at that time. Yeah. There are also elements in Croatia, perhaps even in Slovenia, I don't remember, but certainly in Croatia, that continue to see the Italians as fascists. So I've had conversations with Croatians there and Croatians here who say, yes, the Italians all left because they were fascists. Oh, no, that's not the case. Yeah. But once you've been ingrained by Yugoslav education under Tito, or by the very left-wing education that some people received in Italy in the 1950s and 60s, it's hard to get rid of that idea.
Can I mention one thing about that? When we were in Fiume, Rijeka, in 2003, I think it was, one of my mother's relatives was still living. And when we were in an outside outdoor cafe, and we were discussing what I guess she would see as political business, and she told me to keep my voice down because people are listening. Yeah.
Well, now my mom, who's 97 and suffers from dementia, is currently, when she has a down moment, reliving those times. And if I talk to her, she shushes me and says, quiet, they're listening. Stazito, in ascolta.
Yeah, that's quite common, I think.
Yeah, the elderly who've gone through that period are now reliving it in their dementic years. So, very sad to see. There's a question from Sandra Parmigiani.
Yeah, it was more, more of an observation. And also, I would like to take inspiration from the terrible events that are happening right now in Israel and Gaza, and looking at how during World War II, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was also invaded, and the Axis and the Germans and Italian, the fascists were allied, the official armies. And there had been great acts of violence too. And I'm not justifying the violence against the Italians. I'm just saying that we don't learn anything from history. We do not. Because this idea that the act of violence against all Italians were fascist is not justified. As today, you cannot say that all Palestinians are Hamas. I'm sorry, I don't want to bring current politics. It struck me how close we are in repeating, the same patterns of history. And whereas the Germans went into villages, remember that the Slavs were considered in the 1,000-year German Reich should have been a labor to be used until elimination, until they couldn't work anymore. It was just a subhuman species. We're one of the inferior races. So all this, and I mean, it's not that the Italians were behind many of these crimes. In certain cases, in those areas, the numbers are still undecided. It's part of this history. It still has to be written. Some episodes like Fiume. How many Italians were in Fiume? Whoever you ask, there are different numbers. It's very strange. So I'm just saying that this is something to keep in mind, that what happens to these 350,000 Italians was not deserved, definitely was not deserved. And they paid a price for something that they had not, of which they had not, been culpable. Maybe there were a few people, of course. There are always the hotheads, but then in the end, who pays are families. And as you said, Konrad, when they became refugees, they were many even died in this very, very haphazard accommodation that they received from diseases, even in Trieste. And there was also the resentment of some Italians, I must say, because there were special legislations passed at the time in Italy to try to help them to find some jobs. So sometimes they got precedence over Italians for some positions, and there was resentment for many years. I think some of these laws might still be in place. Of course, they don't mean anything because that time has passed. It's just saying how complex all this is. I just wanted to add this comment, and without politicizing the debate, but without thinking about European history, is very hard to get a grasp on the complexity of the situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Gabriele has his hand up as well. Gabriele, you want to jump in?
Thank you. And thanks very much, Konrad, for such a very informative and engaging talk. And thanks to everyone for the ensuing very interesting discussion. My question, perhaps you can tell me if I read this right, is, let's see if I can articulate it well enough. Seems to me that the Julian Dalmatian diaspora in Canada is much more resilient, much more determined, and you were mentioning Gnosis before, and has a very positive manner of engaging that notion of Gnosis, much more so than the mainstream Italian-Canadian diaspora per se, at large. And I wonder, first of all, you correct me if I'm wrong in this, from my knowledge, and I'm basing it mostly on the literary aspect of this, on the literature of the Julian Dalmatian diaspora. And could this be, if my premise is correct, could this be, Konrad, due to the fact of their particular trauma they had to endure because of the way they were literally taken out of their homeland, and plus the fact that they were moved of their mobility from place to place before settling into an area where they would say, well, finally, I can make this land work for me because it's a multicultural area, which was not perhaps too dissimilar from their original landscape. I mean, that's the way I read their literature. And I'm referring to, of course, to Grolovas, but also to Giuliani, even though he was not an Esule, as you said, and also to a little bit I've read of Caterina Edwards, although in her case it's post-memory. I mean, she being born in England, And a little bit of Bastianotti, of whom I read Barca a Secco.
I think if you talk about the resilience of the Giuliano-Dalmata community in Canada, I would disagree with you because the community is fast disappearing. It was a small community to start with. Pretty well all of them have married exogamously outside the community with people of other nationalities and ethnicities. It's not like, say, a Sicilian immigrant who marries other Sicilians and sort of retains that. I don't know what's happening on the screen, but the pretty pictures are coming up.
I don't know
Somebody,
to me, but I
Gabriele, I think you hit something there. We're seeing landscape. Anyway, I don't think there is resilience in the sense of physical resilience and community resilience. The community is held together, yes, because of the traumatic past and this need to find comfort in each other's company. But that first generation is fast disappearing, and the second and third generations are just not going to be there. Whereas with somebody like the Calabresi, the Sicilians, the question of numbers and the mass of them, or the Friulians, there's hope for a longer term, but in the whole, they will disappear.
I guess I was basing it mostly on the reading, on
that way of thinking by, as you said, the literary aspect.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is due to the fact that the Giuliano-Dalmata community that came here, as opposed to, say, the Sicilians or the Calabresi or the Friulians, who came here because they were dirt poor, many of them with a low education were not the sort of people who would have written novels. Whereas the Giuliano-Dalmati, many of them were middle class, who were not coming here out of poverty. They had been well educated. They had government jobs or teaching positions, and they came here. I don't want to use the term intellectuals, but with better literary skills than their compatriots from the peninsula. And so that might color your view when you talk about the literary survival. Yes, we do have the first two Italian-Canadian novels are by the Istriano and a Fiumano. We have poets and writers and so forth. Considering the small number of the community, their percentage is quite high compared to, say, other Italian regional immigrations. So that's the way I would see it. I see them all as disappearing, the Giuliano-Dalmati disappearing faster than most.
Dylan tried to phone me.
And then the literary aspect, that's why I'm talking about the importance of books. The importance of books to maintain the memory.
And Sandra might have some comments
Yeah,
to the same discussion.
Yeah, following up on Gabriele Nicoli, I really think that they came here also equipped, and I don't speak, I came later, but from what I've seen and what I know of this region, they came here already being well acquainted with a multicultural setting. They were used to it. They were, in fact, the encounter of the cultures they had to deal with were not complementary, but in most cases really almost opposite in language, tradition. And so there was a Germanic, there was the Italian, there was the Slavic. And these are not cultures that, naturally blend, not Romance languages and so they really, and it was part of our nature. It's also part of that Venetian coastal trade tradition that make you interact with all sorts of people, and they were already mixed in many cases, or there was an element of mixture from the Jewish to the Slavic, as of Germanic, as you said, even in their lineage. So for them, I think, there is a resilience that comes from not retrenching in your culture and sort of not communicating with the host culture, but embracing it and becoming part of it. So what you also said, Konrad, that they are disappearing, in a sense they are blending. They are not forgetting their origin, but this speaks to the nature of the people who the Giuliano-Dalmatians are. So that was just my comment.
Just to follow up on that, there's a wonderful poem by Grohvat in which he talks about having to leave Fiume and Fiuman culture and all that, and all the wonderful cultural things they had. He does it in a sort of sarcastic way. But then at the end, he says, well, in Canada, it's pretty much the same. And he says, between Fiume and Canada, it's the same thing. And so he's happy to stay here. And that's how he concludes the poem. Fiume and Canada, same, two sides of the same coin. Oh.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Gabriele.
Gabriele, do you have something to say?
Oh, no,
Or there's someone else maybe on?
Lower your hand, Gabriele. Then
it says my hand is still raised, but I'm not.
click on it again.
So it's from the question.
I think you did share something because we have this beautiful island.
Yeah, you need to stop sharing.
I have to lower my hand. I just lowered.
Yeah, you also need to stop sharing, Gabriele.
What am I sharing? I have no idea what I did here.
A picture of an island.
Oh, that's my desktop.
Yeah.
I
would love to hear from Silvia Pecota, who's an artist that I very much admire. I interviewed her years ago and I've not heard from her since, but Silvia is, I showed you some of her images. Silvia, are you there? I wonder if you could say something about your relationship with Dalmatia, because in that interview article that Paolo Frasca wrote about you, there are some very fascinating things about the importance of the stone that you see in the Dalmatian coast.
She is still on, so I hope she.
Silvia, you're
yep,
muted.
There she is. Yeah.
You're muted, Silvia.
Let me see if I can open the mic for her.
I just want to apologize because I have to leave in 5 minutes, so I'm very sorry. Just
that's
wanted
okay.
to say.
Thank you. I can't unmute it on my end. I don't know if she's having problems with her mic, maybe.
Silvia needs to unmute it. Silvia needs to unmute it at her end, because I cannot unmute it on my end either.
Yeah, I can't on my end.
Silvia's muted.
Maybe she's having problems with her mic.
Maybe. Okay, that's too bad. Because
Yeah.
Silvia was absolutely fascinating when Paolo Frasca and I interviewed her for the book.
Okay, she has her hand up, so maybe she's trying to jump in. Yeah. Anyone else who, while we wait, maybe Sylvia might jump in. If any of the students have any questions with anything we've discussed from class up until now. We touched on a bit of some of the things that you spoke about tonight, Konrad. We did talk about Bubile and also Monica, the gymnast. So I was happy to talk about her too. Yes. But you brought in artists and writers and business people that you've exposed us to. So that's wonderful.
Yep. I should add that Paul Baxa's father was another important figure in our Italian-Canadian community. He was a journalist, a sports journalist here in Toronto. And I had the pleasure of meeting him very late in his life and over lunch at Silvia Pecota's father. And so the two elderly gentlemen just regaled me with stories. And then at one point, Silvia's father, who loves to sing, started to sing. And my mom joined along and they started to sing in Croatian. And I never knew my mom knew Croatian songs, but there she was. Mm-hmm. So that talks of that, that speaks to the multicultural aspect of the community.
Thank you for that. She did drop out. Maybe she's gonna log back in. We'll see.
Yeah, she was
I
having
don't
problems.
see her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting the community. It's so wonderful to see them here and to be part of the conversation as well.
I did that with the graduate course I taught on the Giuliano Dalmati. I invited a dozen or so elderly Giuliano Dalmati, and some younger ones too, to come to class one day, and to share their stories. And it was fascinating, just fascinating, because everybody has their stories.
Yes, and the different experiences um, of their exodus of refugees to Canada, and then others who came here later, right, and in different ways. And I'm glad you touched on all that as well.
I see Grant. Grant is raising his hand. Did you
Oh,
want
okay.
to speak, Grant Karchich?
Yeah, there's one thing that comes out from all of this that's not been talked about is the refugee status of Giuliani coming to Italy after World War II. Because I find that kind of odd, and I don't know. So the question is, a lot of these people went into refugee camps, and my own family went to refugee camps, but that was 1959. All the people had Italians. They were born in Italy, except me. But when they got to Italy, they were refugees. They were no longer really considered Italian. I'm just wondering, the question would be, is the Italian government somehow responsible for the plight of the Giuliani Dalmati? Just another case in point is when Italy capitulated in 1943 during the war, the Italian military left Istria, left Lochin and Zara. And to me, it's like they didn't consider it a part of Italy if they were going back to Italy. And so, do you think I know it's a difficult thing to probably would need some research, but how much do you think the Italian government at the time was responsible for the plight of the so-called refugees?
Well, it has responsibility, yes. The Italian government, I don't think that the soldiers left Istria. I think what happened is the soldiers were leaderless. They did not know what to do. And the Germans came in, and many soldiers were taken by the Germans. And there was some sort of a agreement between Italy and Germany whereby these soldiers became prisoners, but not prisoners of war. And so if you read Rosanna Giuricin's book, In the Maelstrom of History, about the Jewish survivor, she at one point in like Buchenwald or something like that, encounters these Italian soldiers who had been in Istria and had been rounded up by the Nazis and brought to Germany. So there was a breakdown in the chain of command. And when that breakdown happens, some of the soldiers end up prisoners in Germany. Other ones end up prisoners with the partisans, with Tito's partisans. And Grohovats talks about that in his book, Strada Bianca. And some of them go with the Italian army, but very few, because it's hard for them to get to the Italian army because there's half of Italy in between. You know, I mean, there's a division there. So it's not as if the Italian soldiers abandoned, as far as I can see it, is that the Italian soldiers were abandoned and so could not do anything.
Well, there are examples, sorry.
When the refugees come into Italy, what happens is that in this flood of refugees, as we see, as Sandra points out, we see it now in the Middle East. How do you know who is a refugee and who isn't? How do you know that this person by the name of, I don't know, with an itch at the end, is in fact Italian or is an infiltrating communist Yugoslav, right? So I think the need to be more careful. We see that in the United States with the southern border. We see that along the European line with the Middle East. wondering who is a legitimate refugee and who isn't. So I think, as Sandra was saying, it's very complex. And like Sandra, I've been watching the news, and my heart is with what's going on, and my ears keep echoing what happened in the 1940s in my area part of the world.
But
So it is
there's no sense,
complicated.
there's no
So
sense that some Italians and even the government did not do enough for the refugees, because the ones that came after the war, in the early years, had documentation. They had birth certificates,
the
they had
Italian government,
working documents,
yeah, the
Italian.
Italian government could
So
certainly have done a hell of a lot more, no doubt about it. But in 1946, 47, when the Italians had the plebiscite to become a republic, and then when they had their first democratic elections, the communists lost by a hairbreadth. And for the entire 1950s and 60s, the Christian Democrats who governed Italy with an ear and an eye to the communists, because they could at any time win. When I was in Italy in 76 to do my research for the thesis, I remember at the elections standing with the crowd in Piazza della Signoria in Florence, and somebody saying to me, finally, the communists are going to win the government. They did not. But they were very close all the time. So when the Christian Democrats realized that they need to be careful, otherwise they'll lose power to the communists who are just a hairbreadth behind them, they have to be careful about the people coming out of communist Yugoslavia and how they deal with them. So that's why I don't think they did enough. They could have certainly given them lands in the Northeast to rebuild cities, but they scattered them instead, as I said earlier. So I think there's a lot of political dynamics in post-war Italy between the Christian Democrats and the communists that come into play with how the exile, the refugees were dealt with. The Italian government tried, but it didn't try enough, to put it blankly, the way I see it. Sandra, what's your thought on this? You got your hand up.
Yeah, I have my hand up
Jump
because
in, Sandra.
two quick things. And I don't know how much the students know about 1943. Italy basically surrendered, and so the army was left headless because the king and the new prime minister basically fled to the part of Italy which was already liberated by the Allies, and so all of a sudden this Italian army becomes the enemy. And so they really didn't know what to do. So they might have left, but they were the enemy for everybody, I think. They were the enemy for the people in what was, these areas which would become Yugoslavia. They were the enemies for the Germans with vengeance. But I think that, as always, I think it's still to this day, Italy doesn't know what to do with the northeast Italian population. The Rome government never understood very well who these people were, where they came from. I mean, they knew on paper, but there was not a sense of, there was not a deep understanding. And therefore, they didn't take action, I think, in a way which was logical to the Giuliano Dalmati, to this population. And my impression has always been that Italy felt that they had these hordes of people and didn't know what to do with them, did what they could, was not enough. And there was not a plan because they really didn't have a profound understanding of who these people were, where they came from, the land they came from. Italy, I don't know to which point Italy considered that. Italy, it was a big rhetoric of fascism, that was Italy, those were, the mutilated victory of World War I. But the Italian government, run by Rome, didn't really have a profound understanding of the refugees. And when those kept coming, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to say that they resented them, but they sort of were happy to have them go and disperse. And to this day, the Italian Giuliano Dalmati tragedy of the exile, the exodus, and the foibe, all the killings, are still to this day manipulated by the politicians who are in power. And it really hurts to see during the Day of Remembrance. So at times you have these Roman politicians or politicians from other parts of Italy who don't know their history and who just use it for their political agenda. And it is an insult to these people who have been martyred in all these years. And I'm not saying on both sides, you can, but this is happening. And this is also part of the lack of understanding of who these people are. So I'm sorry I could go on forever, but let's stop here. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I
Thank you
can't
for that.
leave this meeting. I have to go, but I can't leave it. It's too
Well, Sylvia is trying to get back in. Maybe we'll end with her. Oh, she dropped out again. She must be having problems with her connection.
I think she's, I
Yeah.
think the video taking
Oh, wait.
time to. Sylvia, are you there?
Yes, but I don't know how to.
Oh, good.
Can you
She
hear
came
me?
in. So we'll end with Sylvia. It is
Great.
9:10, but go ahead, take it, Sylvia.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes, we
hear me?
can.
Oh,
Yeah,
you-
and I think her camera's on too.
The
Oh,
camera's on, but it's not in focusing well.
oh, okay. So Jessica, oh my God, my cat knocked over, disconnected the computer. Sorry. So the mic, you can hear me then, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just about, because it doesn't matter. I have a work from a Wacom screen, which means it's there's no attachment for, there's no camera or video, so I have to do some attachment thing, which is why I'm in a panic here. Okay, well, I'm in. All right, what did you want me to say?
Welcome. Welcome, Sylvia.
Oh, thanks
Sylvia.
for listening. By the way, it was wonderful. I've been taking some screenshots to record so all these amazing poets and writers that I can look up later, and it's fascinating. Thank you so much again.
And the talk will be posted too, Sylvia, so
Oh,
you can go back.
Okay.
Yes, it will be. It's still recording. Conrad, you wanted her to share a bit of her experience with the students?
I wanted Sylvia to say something since she's a tactile artist who does a lot of wonderful stuff. And she's got this vision of her connection with Dalmatia through stone and the color of stone. I wonder if she could speak a little bit about that.
Oh, well, I'm not so sure about that connection with stone, but I have to say the sea is really what captures my heart. And I wrote that story that maybe I should illustrate one of these days, that that you actually wanted to publish, about the little boy, and you came up with the name Marin, about how the little boy had to immigrate, and the two ducks. I don't remember if you remember that story.
Yeah, I remember that.
But I have to say it's the sea that really is beyond beyond inspiring. And I do love stone. And now that I'm thinking, yes, I incorporate rock into my landscape quite a bit with my backgrounds and my art and my photography. And but going to Dalmatia, like I haven't been there in years, but I really miss the beauty of the environment. And I tell you, when I travel to Italy, and as soon as I hear that Venetian dialect, I feel like I'm getting home. Like, it's especially the Triestini. I just love the humor and they swear all the time. I am so at home with all the swearing. And it really is a very passionate culture. And I do believe the sea has something to do with it. The intensity of the color, the sun. There's something about seascape that brings out a joy in people, right? And the inspiration to create, to write, like, so anyway, that's my reflection on Dalmatia.
I would invite everybody to go and visit Sylvia's webpage. You just put in her name and visit the webpage, and you'll see the wonderful stuff that she does.
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that. Thank you.
This has been good.
So do we want to wrap this up, Konrad? We're at 9:15 and I don't see any other questions. If anyone has any other questions. This was really nice to end with Sylvia as well.
Aldo Nazarko's got his hand up. Aldo.
Oh, Aldo, yes, come join us. You want to say some last words?
Oh, I think maybe he's just saying hello.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, I just unmuted myself.
Okay.
But, no comments, but I just want to thank you both for facilitating this, and it's been very interesting, and it's I've learned a lot. Thank you
so
very
much.
Oh, thank you, Aldo,
Thank you.
for
Thank you,
participating.
Aldo. Thank you. And I want to also thank John Walsh, who is with the School of Languages and Literatures, who helped us make this possible. Also, Sandra Parmigiani for having her support and helping me make this possible, and for them supporting this course where the students are learning about Italian immigration. And this just added another story for them to consider in the waves of immigration that we do study. And right now we're looking at the ideas of multiculturalism and multi-ethnic ethnicity that you've highlighted here for us today. So we'll have a lot more to talk about in the weeks to come. Thank you for that, for adding that layer to our course. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank everybody for attending and participating. It's been wonderful. And I apologize for having gone on for an hour and a half. I was planning to do 1 hour, but I lost track of time.
That's okay. I didn't want to stop you because it was a really good presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the community who came, and thank you for the students for staying on. I'll meet you maybe for 15 minutes at our other link, just for 15 minutes, and then I'll let you go. But for now, thank you, Konrad. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the community. Have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Right. Okay.
Good night.